Welcome, welcome. We're back with another episode of the Gothic Heart. Took a break over the holidays, but we're back with an episode that's better than ever. Today's guest is Carol Hughes, who is a paranormal podcaster and researcher. She hosts Real Ghost Stories and The Grave Talks and numerous other background that I can't wait for her to tell you about in radio, and she has so much experience. You guys are going to be really excited to hear about this. So, Carol, you could do a much better intro than I did.
Now I feel like I'm going to let everybody down.
Please take it away.
So actually, so I host a couple paranormal podcasts, which is super fun for me. And my background before I started podcasting was radio. I think a lot of people who formerly did radio do podcasting now. I don't think that's uncommon. But I was in radio for 29 years. I went into work one day and they met me at the door. I was at 20 years at one station and they're like, today's your last day. And I'm like, what did I do? And, so you never know. Sometimes life just throws you some big old curveballs. But I had been a co-host on the Real Ghost Stories with Tony Bruschi. These are his podcasts. And now he kind of does true crime. And he couldn't do both because he doesn't have that much time. And he's like, would you take these two podcasts and run with them? And I'm like, hell yeah. So that's what I did. And it's been a blast. It is so much fun. It's a little weird talking about ghosts and paranormal things all day, but it's fun.
It sounds like the dream to a lot of people. Well, what's really exciting for me is, I always just invite guests on that I want to talk to. Ask questions, so it works out. But what's really exciting, I think, is I haven't had a guest that's been podcasting for as long as you have, or even just in radio and all of that. And so you've seen the changes from podcasting then to how it is now, and you could probably share a little advice for our listeners, for anyone who is interested in getting into that.
I think, if you are interested in getting into podcasts, you need to be a podcast connoisseur. You need to listen, see what you like, see what you don't like. And you also need the right equipment. And you might have to spend a little money doing that because you've heard the podcasts before that aren't really well produced and sounds kind of like they might have just done everything on their phone. And your phone's fine. Like you can go out and get some audio off your phone. I'm not saying you can't do any of that. But it's just, I think it takes a little research and, maybe even reaching out to someone who does it. I was telling you before we started, over the years when I was in radio and then as a podcaster, I've talked to a lot of college classes and about careers in radio. And then it kind of switched to careers in radio and or podcasting. So a lot of those things transfer, but a lot of the kids who want to be in radio, it's such a difficult thing to get into now because they've let so many people go. And, there are radio stations attempting to use AI voices. And so I'm like, you could podcast and everybody thinks, well, I have to come up with this great idea. I have to, get all these followers. You can work for a company that produces podcasts. There are jobs in the podcast business. So you could start like that and have one on the side, and then you can get the on-the-job experience too.
I think that is such a great idea because I think a lot of people, even I told you earlier, didn't even realize that there were podcasting jobs that you could work for companies like that.
I work for a company. It's one of my best friends' company, but still. And it's funny because I talk to people all the time and they're like, how do you make any money doing podcasts? And I'm like, how do you make any money working at the bank? They pay you, It's like, I get paid.
Anybody doing anything?
Yeah, I get paid.
Well, I know that a lot of people, you're a full-time podcaster with, so many followers and listeners, but I know a lot of people start podcasting just as a passion thing. That's exactly how I got started, was just sort of, I wasn't experiencing, and I've been hiding my individuality and my interest and my personality and the type of jobs that I had. So I was like, hey, we can talk about it here and I can find a fellow community that's interested in the same kind of things. And that's just kind of how it happens. So there's so many different ways.
Well, and for me, I will be the first to admit I got really lucky. And I'd met Tony. We worked together at a radio station. He started a podcast. The Real Ghost Stories, I think, started 11 years ago. So it was quite a while. So it was very established by the time he's like, could you run with this? And I think the Grave Talks probably 7 years ago or so, around in there. But he had asked me to come on as a co-host. And so since I knew him so well, I'm like, oh, absolutely. I love talking about ghosts because I grew up in a haunted house. And so it was a really fun thing for me. And I've always been fascinated by it. I'm a little terrified of it at the same time. Like, if you listen to the show, I'm kind of a wuss, but it's who I am. But I think that goes back to when I was a kid, that I really don't want to live like that again. But I'm also drawn to it. And I find that a lot of people who have had paranormal experiences are kind of like me. A lot of them might dive in deeper and do investigations, and they're looking for answers. But we're all still really drawn to it. And because it's like, what did happen? Something happened, but what was it? And I think, I don't know that we'll ever find the answers for sure, any definitive answers anyway. But it's fascinating to talk about.
Yes, the search, the talk, the interest, it's all
Mhm.
fascinating for sure. And I love that that's how you got into it, because that was going to be one of my questions, like what even drew you to the
Yeah.
paranormal in the first place? So, I mean, the titles of your podcasts are fairly explanatory, Real Ghost Stories and The Grave Talks. But do you want to share a little bit about what you guys talk about on those podcasts and what the topics are? And then I want to dive a little bit deeper in like how you find people and how you decide what ghost stories and
Okay.
research and all that.
So they're slightly different. Real Ghost Stories is what you think it is. It is ghost stories that have been submitted to us. They do it voicemail, or they can write it in. If they write it in, I read it. And then there's a few different people who are on the show. Tony still does some episodes. We've got Todd, Tony's daughter, Harper. She's 12. She'll do episodes. My sister is also a co-host. So we all have kind of different takes on how we explain these stories, or we kind of spitball, and here's some, like, it could be this. I don't know. Maybe you do this. Maybe you need to talk to your house and tell your house to quit acting like this. The Grave Talks is also paranormal, but it's more interview based. So I will find someone who has some kind of connection with the paranormal. It might be anyone from a psychic to a lot of authors I talk to. We'll talk about black-eyed kids to cryptids to kind of tiptoeing once in a while into aliens. I don't think aliens are necessarily paranormal, but they are unexplained, and that can be interesting too. So, but more, not really dive into that too much, but I am fascinated by aliens. I don't want to encounter one though. But so they're a little bit different. So that one's interview based. And so I'm looking, it's funny finding guests, like authors, like, because I do like to read, and I'm like, okay, this person wrote an entire book about sleep paralysis. They are the expert. I need to talk to that person. So then sometimes you got to do a little digging on figuring out how to get to that person. As you well know, it's not as easy as just, oh, I think I want to talk to Amity today. So you got to kind of do a little digging. And then a lot of times, like on Facebook, it's interesting. You've probably found this too. Facebook's algorithms are like, she seems to be really interested in the paranormal. Maybe you would like to follow this page. Maybe you would like this. So I get a lot of leads off of that. And then it's kind of one opens a door to another, which is interesting. And now, I get repeat guests, as they write a new book. That happens. There's a guy I'm talking to on Monday, and that'll be his 4th time on the show because he's had different topics we've talked about. And so there's, you make those relationships too. And so that's I find that Facebook, and especially because paranormal, I can just Google paranormal and paranormal groups will come up. Then you kind of got to dig through. There are some, I think, in this field anyway. Well, I guess it would be this way in any field, no matter what topic you're talking about. That I think some people just do it for likes and clicks. and follows, and other people are doing it for different reasons. So sometimes I kind of look at that too. And not that there'd be anything wrong with somebody who's doing it for likes and clicks. I think they could have some really great stories, but it's interesting. Sometimes I don't believe all of it.
Exactly. That
Yeah.
was going to be part of my thing. Like, how are you sifting through and deciding? Yep.
I think it's interesting. I had a guest a while back that the conversation got a little strange as we were going along. And so after I finished the conversation, I was like, do I even share this? Do I post this? Or do I say, whoops, my, I don't know. It used to be like in radio, the tape got ate, but it's not, it's like I lost the file or whatever. I was like, do I make up a lie? And then I'm like, you know what? This is about him telling his story. I'm the one who's getting his story out of him. It's his story. It's not my story. So whether the listener believes it, whether I believe it's not the point is this is his story. And so once I thought about it like that, I'm like, it's not for me to judge. We can all judge. And I had people reach out to me about that particular one. And they were like, I kind of found it was a bunch of BS. And I'm like, yeah, but that's his story.
Yeah.
So I thought
That's
that
a
was
real,
really interesting.
I like that way of thinking about it, of
Yeah.
looking at it. Yeah. That's good. Well, and there's some people, I mean, I've reached out to people that I would love to have, and they're just not comfortable talking, et cetera, which I totally get. It can be very vulnerable being out. So, I just get that it doesn't always come across the way that you want it to. But
Well,
I
and
also feel
you're
like
super conversational. I'm super conversational.
we
So
are.
I just tell people, I'm like, it's just a conversation. And I will go back and clean it up. I will edit it. So if you have a coughing fit, I can take that out. Don't worry about it. And so usually when I get someone on who's never done a podcast before, I just spend a little time with them and be like, hey, it's snowing here today. Or whatever, just a little small talk for 10 or 15 minutes before we get going, kind of like you and I did. And usually people will loosen up because it's like you can talk on the phone, you can talk to anybody,
So true.
And
So true.
I truly believe that everybody has a story. And it might not be a paranormal story, but there's an interesting story to be found in everyone's lives.
100%.
Yeah.
Let's hear. Okay, because you get to talk about all the submissions and the people that talk to you, but how much do you get to talk about your paranormal experiences growing up in the haunted house?
We do talk about that
Okay.
quite a bit. I'm thinking about, I think here in the next few weeks, I'm going to get my siblings on and actually do an episode about the house. I think that would be interesting. But, when somebody says they heard footsteps at night walking down a hallway, I'm like, hey, me too. That happened to me as a kid. That it's relatable. And so I think for me, now someone who's listening to this right now or watching this and they're like, paranormal, I don't believe in it. And there's another thing too, because a lot of people, when they find out I do a paranormal podcast, they're like, yeah, I don't believe in that. But this one time, and they'll follow up with the most paranormal story. And I'm like,
Yep.
okay,
Yes.
then what was that? How do you explain that? And they're like, I don't know. What do you think? I think you had a paranormal experience. I don't get why you're such a skeptic these days, but that's up to you. You do you. But I can relate to it because I have, not just in that haunted house, I've had a lot of experiences throughout my life. And I think that I don't know how to explain it. And so I can believe it when it happens to somebody else. I have zero problems believing it because I don't know what it is. But I do know I have had some very interesting things happen to me that should not have happened. Like, I cannot communicate with my boyfriend who just died, but how am I communicating with, And I did an episode just this week with my nephew. And after my dad died, it was in the early 90s. My nephew was 6-ish, and him and my dad were really close. And Chris was just heartbroken, and he was at the hospital for the week with us, and his siblings. They were all there. It took a week for my dad to pass, and after they got home, Chris, it was very strange, but he's like, so, and this is going to sound kind of funny, but my dad was not your traditional grandpa, and he always had nicknames for everybody. And so he nicknamed himself Grandpa Bozo. I don't know why. So Chris would call him Bozo or Bose. And he's like, so I was talking to Bozo last night. And we're like, oh. And not, you don't want to be dismissive. And I always say that about kids, like, don't dismiss what they're telling you. If they have an imaginary friend or if they see their grandfather after he's passed.
Yep.
So it was really interesting. And I think he got a little bit uncomfortable with it when he was a teenager or something. And so I've never really brought it up. And it went on for months. He had all kinds of conversations. He would tell us all kinds of things that he shouldn't know about. And it was kind of confirmation that he had been talking to my dad. So the other night, he got on the Real Ghost Story show to talk about, because he was an ICU nurse. Now he's a nurse anesthesiologist. So he's definitely a guy of science. And so he was sharing a ghost story that happened to him at a hospital that he had worked at, a really strange experience. And the next thing you know, he's the one who brought up my dad and that whole experience. And so it was really interesting talking to him as an adult because he remembered all of it, to the point, like, he said that we're all Cubs fans. It comes from my dad. We love the Chicago Cubs. And so Chris was brought up with the Cubs. He's a huge Cubs fan. So he said, like there was one day I'm watching the Cubs and then Grandpa just came in and he just sat down. And I was like, was it like kind of see-through? Was he hazy? Was he weird looking? He goes, no. He just came in and sat down. It was like Grandpa just came in and sat down. And they were talking about the game. They're watching the game together. And so I can't tell Chris that did not happen because it really did happen to him, but I can't explain it. And I think it went on for close to a year. And he said that one day he just never saw him again. And he said the first time it started, they'd gotten home after my dad had died, and he was in bed and he was crying, which just broke my heart when he told me this other night, because little Chris, he loved him so much, and he was in bed crying, and he kind of felt something on his bed, and it was my dad. He's like, hey, you okay? And Chris is like, no, I just miss you so much. And then that's how it happened. Isn't that something? So, I mean, I can't explain how that happens, but when those experiences do, it's interesting to hear what's happened to other people. Because I'm like, there's something happening out there that none of us know.
Definitely.
Why did my dad come to me? Although I kind of think he did a couple times. But, why did Chris have that experience? So it's stories like that I just find fascinating. And then having my own growing up in the house that we lived in, I think that's what has drawn me to it all these years later.
So you naturally brought up like two things that I always talk about with every guest. So that was perfect. And I will circle back.
I don't even know what it was.
No, you don't. And I will, well, actually, I'll do that now and I'll circle back around to the other thing I was about to say. So one of the things that you said, which is super common and something we talk about all the time, is that when you tell people what you do, or you or work in paranormal and talk about ghosts and paranormal experiences, that people, don't believe it or scoff or maybe look down on us or anything like that. Or maybe even something as a kid, if you said something was haunted and don't believe you or whatever, dismissed, like you were saying, and we shouldn't dismiss children. Well, for most of us that have sort of more alternative interests, which are of course much more accepted nowadays, but not as much in the previous. I had a lot of those kinds of experiences growing up. It's a phase, it's this, it's that. So it sounds like you did too. And I love to tell people, we've gone into ad nauseum how I got through it and how I became acceptance, but I love to hear it from other people.
How I got through the haunted house experience?
Well, no, just any like scoffing or... No, but like scoffing about what you're interested in, or like at your job, oh, paranormal, like
Yeah.
that's those
You
kinds
know,
of dismissive comments.
I'm kind of like, somebody told me once, I had a guest on the show, and I found this to be really profound. She said they don't believe in it because they've never experienced it. So, how can you believe in something that's never happened to you? And so I think that's so true. It's like if it has happened to you, if you've lived an experience that you can't explain, and that holds true for a number of different things, that then how could you believe in something you haven't ever experienced? So I like, yeah, if you've never had any weird experience, then of course you would say it doesn't exist because it's never existed for you. Now, the vast number of people things have happened to,
Right. Or
I
they
think
follow
that's
up with
kind of
that.
interesting. Yeah. So so when people scoff at me, I'm like, and actually most people really don't because they just think it's kind of cool that I podcast.
In
Although
this day
most
and
of them
age.
don't understand how I make any money doing it. That's more the scoffing part. Like you must not make any money at all. And but I'm like, I'm paid just like you are, you know?
It's a job.
Yeah. And now I have a fun job. I get to work from home, as you can probably tell. And I've got pets and I love doing it. And it's interesting to be able to transition into something I love doing radio for so many years into something like this because it's kind of a natural transition for me. So I think people who really do know me and I still do radio part-time. I get to do it from home. I do a radio show every day. So it's kind of fun to still have my foot in that world and my foot in this world, but most people who know me don't find it surprising. And if
Gotcha.
they do, ask me a question. I don't care.
It's something else I really wanted to know. So I know you had your experiences in the haunted house. You dive into tons of paranormal experiences and stories. Do you ever, on a trip or anything, go seek out some of the places you've talked about?
Every trip,
Yes, me too.
everywhere I go. Like it's weird because I don't want to spend the night in a haunted hotel. I don't want to hear kids outside my door. I don't want things touching me. So I'm happy to stay in a Best Western that's not known to be haunted. But I have left in the middle of the night before. I'm like, I ain't staying here.
Duh.
This is not right, and I don't know what is going on, but it's time to go.
So you're not going to come visit me and stay at the Stanley Hotel?
Although my sister really wants to stay at the Stanley Hotel. And I'm like, there's nowhere to go. And that was my point. I'm like, if we leave there in the middle of the night, we can't just drive like in Eureka Springs. We left the Crescent Hotel in the middle of the night and there was a Best Western and we got a good night's sleep. Where do we go? If it's a Stanley Hotel, where the hell are we going to go?
I don't know. I'm only
Anything
like
out there, right?
35 minutes from it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'd be knocking at your door. When I stay at your house.
It's too scary. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, but I love to go on ghost tours. I'm really, really drawn to history and historical places. And I love looking at old mansions and houses. And I just love that stuff. So I'm super drawn to all of that. Now, do I want to spend the night in the haunted mansion? No. Do I want to go in and check it out? Absolutely. Yeah.
That makes perfect sense. We do. Pretty much my favorite place in the entire world is New Orleans, and we used to go every other year. Kids have tied that up some, but checking out the mansions there are open house tours, plus, I mean, tours up the wazoo on
Oh,
haunted
yeah.
and ghost stories and stuff. I took my then 3-year-old on a ghost tour for kids of New Orleans, where she
Oh,
got to
that's fun.
it was. She made like a little gree bag and she felt like vibrations on the LaLaurie mansion, and they were like hunting for ghosts with one of the tools. I mean, she had a great time. It was centered towards kids, but bringing up the kids right.
Exactly. A well-rounded childhood.
So much fun. And one other thing I had realized is that I saw that you recently, and I haven't had a chance to listen to it yet, but I just wanted to comment but you recently did an episode on Amityville, the house, which
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Always
Actually,
gonna have a connection too.
that was one that Tony had done. And Tony is really the guy who's dug into the Amityville house, and he's talked to all kinds of different people who like investigated it, people who were on the scene when things happened. So he's done tons of investigations into that. So that's his specialty, is the Amityville house. You know, it's interesting because I've talked to people who's like, it's one of the most haunted houses ever. I've talked to other people who's like, not haunted at all. Now, I think that just depends on your experience. I think because you go someplace that's known to be haunted and you don't have an experience doesn't mean that it's not haunted. It just means you didn't have an experience for whatever reason. I think you can build up some walls. I think you're just not open to it, maybe. But I think it, like, how could it not be haunted? How could it not? When you think about what happened in that house. So I don't know. My thing, and I recently watched the original movie again.
The original? Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
the
So the
original.
one with the Brolin. Okay,
Yeah,
not
Josh
Ryan
Brolin
Reynolds.
was in it. And I can't remember the girl. I can see her face. But it was kind of cheesy. I watched it in an old theater in town, and then we did a ghost hunt afterwards. So it was pretty fun. But I don't know. You just think about what happened in that house. It's like, how could it not be haunted? Come on.
Yeah, I don't see a way. But
Yeah.
I completely understand the like closed off, not open to it, or the people that, my husband is one of those. I'm constantly arguing when something happens. So he'll be like, because he's a scientist, he's like, oh, have some explanation. I'm like, no, it's just a ghost. So go off with it. Like it was here a second ago. Yeah, I'll come up with something. I'm like, you don't know that that's not what it is. So I'm always having that with him. But Amityville, because my name is Amity, so I'm always loving it. And a lot of times people don't know how to say my name or pronounce it. And I'll be, once I say it's Amity, like Amityville Horror, people are always like, oh, okay.
Then they never forget it.
True. However, so I didn't mention this earlier, but I'm a custom jewelry, or I do fine jewelry with more of a Gothic vintage alternative twist. That's my company. And a lot of the times the brides, if I do a lot of engagement and wedding rings that I talk with are younger, right? And so they don't know what Amityville Horror is anymore. It is mind-boggling. I'm like, there's like 8 movies. Come on.
And they get really cheesy. In fact, most of them are pretty cheesy, actually, thinking back on them.
It's not, I was like, how do you not know what this is? Oh, it's just crazy. One other thing, because we've talked about a lot of cool things, but one other thing I'm really, really dying to know is because you are worked so hard to have this podcast for so long, and so you have a lot of listeners, and so you get submissions for ghost stories, etc. So how do you decide, or maybe it's not you, maybe is there like background research you do into it, or which ones to talk about, or how does that work?
So that is interesting. I put all the shows together. So I go through all the stories, all the phone calls. Once again, it goes back to that is their story.
Yep.
And they're sharing what happened to them. Do I need to believe all of it? Not necessarily. But there are some that I believe, like, I'm not buying this. Like, I think that sometimes people just write something in, or, there are people who will call or write in who I don't know how to put this nicely, who maybe have some mental health issues.
Okay, gotcha.
And so sometimes some of those, I'm like, this doesn't feel right. And it feels, and we've had some that come from kids, 15, 16 years old. And I don't want to really exploit that. We've had lots of stories from kids. I have no problem with that. But sometimes it just gets to a point. My sister and I were doing one night, and we both decided this is uncomfortable. And let's not do this story. Because I felt like she needed mental health help. And I felt like I was exploiting her in a way. Like,
there's always that kind of balance. I had some paranormal investigators on before, and they are always talking about, having to balance whether it is truly a paranormal thing or more of a mental health thing, whether their health is really
and
needed.
I've talked to paranormal investigators when people are saying their house is haunted, that could also be schizophrenia. you don't know. And so they do have an extensive list, most, legit paranormal investigators. They will have an extensive list of questions that they'll ask people.
Mhm.
And, they'll want, and they want to do their research. And I agree with that. I think that's a good idea. So I kind of do that. But, for the most part, I believe them because they're sharing what happened to them. It might sound incredible to me or you, or, well, maybe to me, because I've had a lot of experiences, so I can buy a lot of different things. But I think that, just because I haven't had that experience doesn't mean it can't happen,
Sure.
you know? So, so yeah, I feel like it's their stories and we're just sharing their stories and then we discuss it.
Yeah. I mean, and it's valid to them,
Mhm.
what happened to them and how they felt about it. Even if someone else
Exactly.
would feel differently in the same situation, it's
And
still,
like
that's their
like
valid.
the Amityville Horror is a good example. Like I really don't buy the scene when he goes back in the house to get the dog and the blood is coming out of the walls. I'm like, blood coming out of the walls. Like, why would that even happen in a paranormal experience? That seems to me a mental health crisis if you're seeing blood coming out of the walls. But so I don't really buy that. So sometimes when it gets to that level of story that gets that weird, then I might not share it.
Well, and it can be, the way we remember things,
E-
embellishments, etc.,
Exactly.
or
Exactly.
exaggerations. Definitely happens. Definitely happens. So that all makes sense. Um, oh, so much fun. And one last thing that I had on my notes that I wanted to point out for our listeners about you is because I love to bring on people of all sort of different jobs and occupations because a lot of times people that have our interests don't want to conform or hide their individuality to work like I used to as a lawyer or in corporate operations. So these alternative jobs you can have and still have and still have your interests. So we've had on, research authors, we've had on practicing witches, we've had on, practicing akashic energy, akashic records, etc. But here you are bringing us our first example of you are still in this field, still getting to experience all of this, even though you are not one of the practicing um, sort of supernatural alternative um, practices or God, I don't even know what I'm trying to say, but like have that energy, and that's what you're doing. So I want to show people that because I don't either. I mean, I still love it and want to be part of it, but just because I don't have those abilities, or maybe I do and I just haven't discovered them yet, doesn't mean we can't be in this field. And I just love that you are a perfect example of that.
I think that it's interesting because I have definitely had the paranormal experiences
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of them. Um, I have also had things happen after people have passed away that I can't explain. Um, so do I consider myself a medium? No. Do I consider myself open to it? Absolutely. And so, and I've had people pass away who I was 100% sure I would hear from, and I never did. And so I don't know how that works. And there are people who are very in tune to that. And I find that fascinating. I can walk into a location and I physically can respond to it. Like my heart will race. I get really short of breath and I'm like, oh, something's here, something's here. It's like kind of almost a mini panic attack. I'm like, ooh, what is this?
I know what
And
you mean.
like it happened to me a while back. I went in Dodge City, Kansas at Boot Hill. I was the only one there that day. I was just blowing some time. I had this meeting and I thought, I'm going to go walk around Boot Hill for a little bit. And I'm the only one there that day, which was kind of weird. And none of the buildings are original except for two. I think it's two or three. And so there's a lot of items in there, and I'm looking at them, and they're kind of creepy. Like there's a doll case, and I get creeped out by creepy dolls. But I walked into this house that was one of the original buildings, and I walked in, and all of a sudden I got that reaction. Like I'd walked this is towards the end of the walk. And I'd walked all through everything and I'm not having any reaction. I just open the door and step in and I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. I just walked into something. and I can feel it. My heart's racing and I'm shaky and I'm short of breath and I'm like, oh, what is it? What is it? Then I heard somebody walking above me. And there was nobody in the room, in the building. I asked, I'm like, hey, did people was there somebody upstairs? And they're like, no, no. And I'm like, okay, just wondering. And I was like, that was a haunted place. So I came back, I Google it, and I was by far not the only person who'd ever had an experience there. So I definitely have experiences, but it's not anything like I go out and look for.
Yep.
You
Yep.
know, like in my own house. I don't want it. I want to have a nice, calm house. I don't want to be woke up in the middle of the night with something standing in my doorway. I just don't. Or, weird. I don't know. And I think that too. My sister and I were talking about it the other night. I think that also goes back to being a kid. Like, I didn't like that then. It was very unnerving and it was very frightening to me. But what was it? And so it's kind of interesting to get to explore it just sitting here behind a microphone
Well,
and
you
not
can
having to go out and
choose.
do it.
Like, you're not going to be woken up by something. You
No,
can choose when you are ready to go visit a haunted house or anything,
absolutely.
right? It's not going to
Absolutely.
happen to you. And
Yeah.
I'm just like you. I have the experiences, I have the feelings, but I don't consider myself as someone who is able to, be a practicing, medium or psychic or anything like that.
I don't
But
want to bring anything home. Like in my house, I don't have antiques. I don't want an antique. And I even brought some home from my mom's house that she had, and I'm not okay. I was not okay. And I was like, there's some weird ass dolls in there in this cedar chest that she had. And one of them we actually threw away. I'm like, that is not going into
it's
my
got to go.
house. Mm-mm. And it was probably from the late 1800s, and I'm sure somebody would have loved to have it. I did interview somebody who had a haunted doll museum once, and he's like, God, I wish you'd have saved that and sent it to me.
That's
And I'm
right
like,
up
what
their
was I
alley.
supposed to do with it? Like, where was it going to go in the meantime? But I just looked at it and I was like, I can't have that in my house. But there are dolls in there. I just haven't looked at them since I brought it into my house. And it seems to be fine. I have nothing going on.
Well, we have talked about the real ghost stories and the grave talks, a bunch, and we're going to have all of that listed in the show notes with links for to you and to listen in the podcast. But is there anything that I'm missing or that you want to share with them, that with our listeners, that they can learn more?
I mean, I think if you listen to the show, definitely they'll know more about what we do.
Yeah.
But if they have any experiences, I would love to hear them.
That's a good point.
That I would love. So if you've had a paranormal experience, because you could write it in, you could leave a voicemail. But also, we could do a whole, if you lived in a haunted house, I would do a whole episode on that on the Grave Talks. I found a guy recently and that he just lived in a haunted house. And I'm like, you want to talk about it? And he's like, absolutely. And so we did a really fun episode. It was great because it was like the whole story had a beginning, middle, and that one ended. Like whatever it was went away. And I thought that was fascinating. Like I have a friend of mine who had a really interesting experience with her best friend who passed away. So she's going to do an episode with me. And so, yeah, I just love the experiences and I love to hear the stories. So if anybody has one, reach out. My email is carol@realstorymedia.com and you can just message me.
We'll put that in the links as well. Yeah. And I bet it's really therapeutic in a way for people to talk about them as well with it.
I think to know sometimes you have a safe place to talk about it and you're not being judged. Because like I said, it's not my story, it's their story. So even if it goes off into that's weird, never quite heard that before. I think it's their story. And that's why I don't like to edit them much. I like them to be what they are. But like I said, once in a while, I feel like this is a mental health issue and I don't feel comfortable with it. But, if you've got a story, share it. And I find them just fascinating. And so many people have a story. And that I find really interesting where they'll be like, yeah, I don't believe in that, but this one time. And then they tell you a story I'm like, well, how do you not believe in it if that happened to you?
How are you explaining it?
Yeah.
My friend that actually lives in Kansas that I had mentioned to you, near where you live, has a paranormal experience. So I am going to encourage her to submit to you.
Oh my God, I would love that. And
Yeah.
in fact, she could just call me. She can email me. I'll give her my number. She can call me. We could get together and talk about it.
Oh my gosh, I
Because
bet
we
you
are
would love
only
that.
1 hour apart, me and your friend. Because we established where she lives. So she lives very close
Yes.
to me.
So after your snowstorm is done.
Yes, it's snowing right now. On top of the blizzard we got this weekend, it's snowing again.
Well, so excited. I'm so grateful that you came on and shared some of your behind the scenes, and definitely encouraging listeners to listen. I mean, you've millions, not millions, but lots and lots and lots of episodes. So there is absolutely
There are
something that is
thousands
going to,
and
yeah,
thousands of
so many
episodes.
episodes that will pique someone's interest. So anyone listening here today, please make sure you like, follow, subscribe. But as I always say, most importantly, share. There is someone you know that is going to get value or be interested in Carol's podcast, this podcast, what we talk about. And that's how we keep it going. And that's how we make this community and get the stories for Carol's podcast or the guests for this one. So we'd love it if you could share and check out the websites and definitely find an episode. And if you don't know where to start, Amityville Horror, Amityville absolutely is a great place to
That's a good
begin.
one.
Well, thank you so much, Carol. I
Thank
really
you. This was
appreciate you
really a
joining
fun
us.
conversation.
We will have everything in the show notes. So if anybody has any questions, just check down below or send it our way. We'll see you on the next episode. Bye for now.